Okay, I'm not sure how much you're remembering about descriptive outlining, but at the beginning of the semester when we started doing our article of the weeks, I explained to you how important this strategy would be to you as we progress through the semester. And as we've entered into this study about rhetoric and understanding authors' purposes and the argumentative strategies that authors use to address readers and to get their points across, descriptive outlining becomes a process that helps you examine exactly how that argument is structured. So we're going to go through this presentation about the steps, the complete set of steps that are involved in completing a descriptive outline. And then we're going to begin the descriptive outlining process looking at the Jeremy Rifkin article. So make sure that you have something to write with, maybe even some Post-its depending on how much space you think you need to write in your margins, and also a highlighter or two, preferably a yellow highlighter, but because you've already read the Rifkin article, you should have the highlighted information available to you already. And then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so what is descriptive outlining and how does it work? Okay, so descriptive outlining is about describing what texts say and do. And you will also need, I didn't mention this before, the activity that we've been working on the words that describe what texts do, because that's exactly what descriptive outlining is all about. So the terms that you've outlined on that handout and defined are going to become critical to your descriptive outlining process. Descriptive outlining enables you to extend your understanding of what a text or visual image says into how it is working rhetorically or what it does. Descriptive outlines are also called says and does outlines. Says being the summary portion of what you're going to be doing. Does being the rhetorical, I'm going to run out of space, function or purpose of what a text does. Okay, I'm going to change the thickness of the pen that I'm using on that because that's hardly visible for you. All right, I'm good to go. Okay, here we go. Summary outline. A says statement summarizes the content of a section of text, and you can be looking at a sentence, a paragraph, or a group of paragraphs, or what we commonly refer to as chunks. And completing the following sentence frame will help you to produce a says statement. This section or paragraph or whatever it is that you're working with says blank. That automatically suggests that what you're doing is summarizing a set of information because of the word says. Remember that you must paraphrase any information that you write as a says statement. It cannot be copied directly from the text. We call that, you're right, plagiarism. The does statement explains how a section, paragraph, or group of paragraphs support the author's argument. They identify the purpose behind what the author is writing. In order to get an accurate purpose statement, you would complete the following sentence frame. This section or paragraph, something. And as we've been studying grammar, the fact that we've got this paragraph, we know that the subject in this case is paragraph, and the next word would have to be one of those verbs or action words that describe what that particular part of the text is doing. So see the list, words that describe what texts do for words and explanations of text purposes. So the step-by-step descriptive outlining descriptive outlining process. First step is to prepare your text. And to prepare your text, you're going to do what we've done a couple of times already in class. You're going to draw a line across the page where the introduction ends. And you have to decide, is the line drawn after the first paragraph or if there are multiple paragraphs involved in the introduction. And you can work backwards and try and locate the conclusion, or you can continue to proceed through the text from the point of the introduction. That is pretty much a stylistic choice. But divide the body of the essay or the text into sections on the basis of the topics that are addressed. So when you see that the text has changed subject, supporting point, you should draw a line between the supporting points. And then you will draw an additional line where the conclusion begins, so that the last set of paragraphs are the concluding paragraphs. And again, you have to decide if it's the last paragraph or if the conclusion begins before that final paragraph. Step 2 begins the outlining process. And I've said label the left margin says and label the right margin does. But again, this is a stylistic thing, and I think on any given day I probably reverse the order. It's just as easy to write your does statement in the left margin as it is your says statement, and vice versa. For some people, it's easier to write a says statement than it is a does statement. For some people, it's the opposite. So you have to figure out which way you prefer to do it. But I do suggest that once you make that decision, you do it the same way every time, so that you don't confuse yourself by putting your says statements where your does statements should go. That will affect how well you can accurately use the information that you've got in your margins to begin a writing assignment. So for each section of the text, write a does statement and record it in the right margin. For each paragraph in a section, write a summary or says sentence that summarizes the most important information in that particular text. If you've got a section that has multiple paragraphs and each paragraph has its own set of information, you might end up writing a sentence for each of the paragraphs and then combining them into a compound sentence or complex sentence or compound complex sentence, depending on the information. But whichever way you go, you would record the summary sentence, that set of sentences, as one sentence in the left margin. Step 3, after you've done all of your does and says statements, is to examine each section by analyzing the author's rhetorical structure. Which of the sections is the most developed? For the section that has the most information, is it more developed than the other paragraph or the other section simply because it was a harder topic to prove or a harder supporting point to prove, or the writer seemed to have a little more knowledge about that particular section than they did any of the other sections? Or is it just being wordy? And you have to decide exactly why there's more information in one section than there is in another, and how that affects you in terms of the overall argument. Then which section is the least developed? Which one has the least amount of information? And again, why does it seem to have so little information? Is it the point that he makes is so strong that there is no other information that you would consider in that particular argument? Or is it because there isn't much information that supports that argument? Therefore, he's done the best he could with convincing you of that point with the information that he had at his or her disposal. Then which section is the most persuasive? It could very well be that although a given section only has a limited amount of information, the information that's provided is so strong that it could still be far more persuasive than any section that had lots of information. Sometimes less is more. The last step is to make sure that you can identify the text's main argument. And remember, we've talked about supporting points have to support whatever that argument is, because that's regular essay or rhetorical structure. I give you a main argument. Everything else that I provide to you has to support that argument. But sometimes the argument is explicit, meaning it is clearly stated that this is what I think, this is what I believe. And sometimes it's just implied. It gets to the bottom of the of the text, but it hasn't ever clearly stated what it is it wanted you to do or what the author was believing. And so you have to evaluate all the information presented to figure out what was the overall goal of the text. Okay, we're going to apply what we've been learning about in the PowerPoint on descriptive outlining to the article, A Change of Heart About Animals, written by Jeremy Rifkin. Now, the title, A Change of Heart About Animals, gives us some expectations on what we should expect from the article, namely something to do with animals. Now, the idea of having a change of heart suggests that something about the way we feel about animals is going to change based on the content that the article is going to present. The article begins, "They are more like us than we imagined, scientists are finding." The "they are," we'd have to assume, has something to do with the idea of animals, but we don't know for sure exactly where the author is going. That first sentence almost sounds like a subhead, but that's not the way it seems to be organized in the article. Paragraph 1 begins, "Though much of big science is centered on breakthroughs in biotechnology, nanotechnology, and more esoteric questions like the age of our universe, a quieter story has been unfolding behind the scenes in laboratories around the world, one whose effect on human perception and our understanding of life is likely to be profound." This idea that somehow what we're going to be talking about is human perceptions, and what we perceive as human kind of takes us back to the idea of animals, and are animals considered human? So let's continue with this idea of human perception. What these researchers are finding is that many of our fellow creatures are more like us than we had ever imagined. Fellow creatures. What fellow creatures is the author referring to? And what does fellow creatures have to do with animals? They feel pain, suffer and experience stress, affection, excitement, and even love. And these findings are changing how we view animals. So, this idea that, based on this idea of animals feeling pain, suffering, and experience stress, affection, excitement, and even love, somehow we're supposed to reconsider how we view animals. I guess they're not just pets anymore, but we'll have to read on to see. Strangely enough, some of the research sponsors are fast food purveyors such as McDonald's, Burger King, and KFC. Pressured by animal rights activists and by growing public support for the humane treatment of animals. Humane treatment of animals. Humane sounds like human. So is there growing public support for treating animals as if they were humans? That's a question mark there. These companies have financed research into, among other things, the emotional, mental, and behavioral states of our fellow creatures. Well, now if we were going to go by the content so far, I would say that your introduction ends somewhere around here, because here we introduce this idea that there's some science going on in different areas, but this one area here where we're going to talk about there's some research that's going to change human perceptions, and those human perceptions are somehow tied to this idea of how we view animals, and the fact that paragraph 3 goes into the research that's mentioned above would suggest that that's where the intro ends, and now we're going to start looking into more details or greater depth about the research that's being studied. So it continues. Strangely enough, Some of the research sponsors are fast food purveyors such as McDonald's, Burger King, and KFC. Pressured by animal rights activists and by growing public support for the humane treatment of animals, these companies have financed research into, among other things, the emotional, mental, and behavioral states of our fellow creatures being animals. Studies on pigs' social behavior funded by McDonald's at Purdue University, for example, have found that they crave affection and are easily depressed if isolated or denied playtime with each other. So, pigs crave affection and are easily depressed if isolated or denied playtime with each other. Playtime makes it sound like pigs are children. That's an interesting theory. The European Union has taken such studies to heart and outlawed the use of isolating pig stalls by 2012. In Germany, the government is encouraging pig farmers to give each pig 20 seconds of human contact each day and to provide them with toys to prevent them from fighting. Other funding sources have fueled the growing field of study into animal emotions and cognitive abilities. Okay, so we just switched from one study to another study because in the previous paragraphs we were talking about the studies done by Burger King, McDonald's, and KFC. And those are the same studies because here we're still talking about social behavior that was funded by McDonald's at Purdue. And the European Union, has taken such studies to heart and outlawed the use of isolating pig stalls. That's still talking about the pig studies, so we have to keep those paragraphs discussing research into pigs together, which would suggest that this section should be split here because now we're talking about other funding sources that have fueled the growing field of study into animal emotions and cognitive abilities, which establishes the idea that the next paragraphs are going to give us a little more information on those additional studies. So, back to paragraph 6. Other funding sources have fueled the growing field of study into animal emotions and cognitive abilities. Researchers were stunned recently by findings published in the journal Science on the conceptual abilities of New Caledonian crows. So now we're going to talk about crows. Okay, crows it is. In controlled experiments, scientists at Oxford University reported that two birds named Betty and Abel were given a choice between using two tools, one a straight wire, the other a hooked wire, to snag a piece of meat from inside a tube. Both chose the hooked wire. Abel, the more dominant male, then stole Betty's hook, leaving her with only a straight wire. Betty then used her beak to wedge the straight wire in a crack and bent it with her beak to produce a hook. She then snagged the food from inside the tube. Researchers repeated the experiment, and she fashioned a hook out of the wire 9 out of 10 times. Equally impressive is Coco, the 300-pound gorilla at the Gorilla Foundation in Northern California, who was taught sign language and has mastered more than 1,000 signs and understands several thousand English words. On human IQ tests, she scores between 70 and 95. Tool making and the development of sophisticated language skills. Oh, hold on a second. But wait a minute. We've stopped talking about funding and now we're talking about the development of sophisticated language skills. So let's tentatively say that there may be a break right here because it sounds like there's a shift coming. And then let's go on to page 2. Okay, so here we are back on the first page, and if you just flip through your article, you'll find that you've got 9 paragraph chunks, and within those 9 paragraph chunks you have the intro and the conclusion as well. Even though they are not supporting paragraphs, they are critical to understanding what the article is going to be about and how the author wraps up his argument. So they are deserving of does and says statements. In the presentation, when we talked about how to set up your descriptive outline, one of the things that was mentioned was to label one side or the left paragraph as your does and the right paragraph as your says. And so that's how I'm going to begin my outline as well. This box is a little big because we don't have a complete 1-inch margin here, so we're going to make the best of what we've got as soon as I can get my text feature to work. So let's give it a shot. This is going to be our does side, so we're going to begin this one with this paragraph something, because this was the frame that I told you you could use to help you understand or keep track of your does and says statements. So and really it's not a paragraph, so let's kind of back that up a little bit. And we'll say this section instead of paragraph, since we have grouped it together. And then if I were going to shift into a highlighter, that I could get a better grasp on, okay, so what's really being said in this section, what are the most important ideas, that would kind of go a long way toward helping me identify where I want to go. So I'm going to shift some of my stuff into highlighter mode, and hopefully this works because this is my first time trying to do it. So we're looking for the key ideas in these first 2 paragraphs that are going to help us know where the author is going. We talked about that first sentence as just kind of almost sounding like a subtitle, but because of its positioning, we know that that's not the way it is. It's just kind of an attention getter. They are more like us than we imagine, scientists are finding. Though much of big science is centered on breakthroughs in biotechnology, nanotechnology, and more esoteric questions like the age of our universe, a quieter story has been unfolding behind the scenes in laboratories around the world, one whose effect on human perception and our understanding of life is likely to be profound. What these researchers are finding is that many of our fellow creatures are more like us than we ever imagined. Okay, that to me would seem to be a pretty significant statement that you are making, that these researchers are finding that many of our fellow creatures are more like us than we had ever imagined. In fact, I would venture to say that a lot of what we've read in the subsequent paragraphs go into a lot more detail on how they're more like us. This idea of feeling pain and suffering and experience stress, affection, excitement, and even love, and these findings are changing how we view animals. Well, that last statement is yet to be seen as to whether or not it's actually changing how we view animals, but we'll go with the first statement and take that one as ideal, more or less. Okay, let me see if I can adjust my highlighter pen here a little bit and maybe get a little wider width. And then let's see about this whole opacity issue, because that doesn't look like it's showing up at all. Let's see how this one works. Okay, here we go. Strangely enough, Some of the research sponsors are food purveyors, such as McDonald's, Burger King, and KFC. Of course, a purveyor is just a person who sells something. Pressured by animal rights activists and by growing public support of the humane treatment of animals, these companies have financed research. Okay, so this idea of almost like blackmail, really, huh? He's suggesting that it is because, well, that opacity thing didn't work. Oh, well, let's try that one. That pressured by animal rights activists. No. Okay, let's give us a little bit of opacity. Pressured by animal rights activists. Here we go. And by growing public support for the humane treatment of animals, these companies have financed research into, among other things, the emotional, mental, and behavioral states of our fellow creatures. Okay. All right, then what else is he saying in this section? Studies on pig social behavior funded by McDonald's at Purdue University have found that they crave affection and are easily depressed if isolated or denied playtime with each other. Well, to me, that statement is a supporting point because we're talking about the research that has identified the emotional, mental, and behavioral states of our fellow creatures. And if that's where he's going, then this paragraph 4 is just supporting that idea that he introduces in paragraph 3. The European Union has taken such studies to heart and outlawed the use of isolating pig stalls by 2012. In Germany, the government is encouraging pig farmers to give each pig 20 seconds of human contact each day and to provide them with toys to prevent them from fighting. So, this first point up here has to do with what's happening in the United States. And so does this idea of McDonald's at Purdue University. That's also tied to the United States. So this idea of the European Union, I'm not really sure what's considered the European Union. Or also the fact that Germany is not really part of the European Union. Okay, but, well, if the above information is going to talk about the United States, and we're going to get down here and talk about the European Union, and even talk about Germany, then we'd have to go with the general idea that this isn't just something that's limited to the United States, and that perhaps this change of heart about animals is also occurring all over the world. It's not just a United States phenomenon. And if that's the case, then we are going to need to go back up to the top and start writing our descriptive statements so that we'll be able to move through the paragraphs relatively easily after this point. So I'm going to switch back into our text mode up here and go back into this first paragraph that we were writing about. And as soon as I can get my cursor to go where I want it to go, we're going to begin finishing this particular statement. Although the cursor seems to be having a mind of its own. Let's see. This section introduces the idea. Let's see. Okay. Hold on a second. Let me figure this out. Well, let's see. It didn't completely change the way I wanted it to change, but, we'll work out those kinks later on. So, what I'm going to do, since double tapping is still not getting me... Oh, wait. I think I might have almost gotten it. Double tapping is not quite getting me where I want to go. Let's just start a new line. So this is an introduction. Writing an introduction statement should be the easiest statement that you can, short of a conclusion, because you already know what it does. It introduces. So this section, introduces, oops, let me change that pen so we'll be able to read it. Right now it thinks it's yellow. We're going to take it back to black. Okay, that should be good, I'm hoping. Let's give it a try. There we go. This section introduces the idea or the topic of, you can't read that over the text. Looking at animals from a different perspective based on research. Okay? Because it basically places the research or the writer's subject in the context of research. Okay? Now, the says statement is simply a statement where we discuss the context. Exactly what does it actually say? And we've got that sentence actually already highlighted in yellow right here. Okay, so putting in a says statement is going to have a lot to do with what we've already identified in that paragraph. And I don't have a whole lot of margin, so work with me on this. You have a lot more margin available to you on your paper. Go ahead and use what you've got. Remember, we have to paraphrase ideas. We can't write anything verbatim or just as it appears in the text. We have to put it in our own words. So what these researchers are finding is that many of our fellow creatures are more like us than we had ever imagined. In my words, this section says research into animal behavior reveals similarities previously thought not to exist between animals and humans. Okay, so this section says research into animal behavior reveals similarities previously thought not to exist between animals and humans. That's a rough statement, and of course when you get ready to put your whole summary together, you'll be able to tweak those sentences so that they are a lot clearer than what I'm doing on the fly here. That's what proofreading and editing is all about. Okay, so now looking to the second section. In the second section, we have this sentence about pressured by animal rights activists and by growing public support for the humane treatment. And then we have also the European Union taking such studies. We don't need the whole thing about McDonald's at Purdue because that's not significant enough. So when we write this one, we are going to begin again with our does statement. And it is going to read as follows. Let's see, this section explains or identifies research studies conducted by fast food companies into animal behavior. Well, not just behavior, because we're talking about emotional, mental, and behavioral states of our fellow creatures. Okay, so into the emotional, psychological, and behavioral practices of animals. Okay, so that's a does statement. And over here, we put in a says statement to summarize the information that we've highlighted in this section. Okay, so a says statement in this case would say something to the effect of, this section says, okay, the research proves animals possess the same emotions or well, maybe not all of the same. How about we say possess many of the same emotions experienced by humans. Now, we can also add a little bit about the changes that are coming as a result of that research, but we don't get a whole lot as to what kind of changes it's bringing about in the United States. All we know is what's happening in Germany. So we can go with the Germany thing, but I don't know that buys us a lot of support by talking about something that's happening in Germany when we don't really have anything to compare it to in the United States. And you really have to wonder, then why is he giving us information about Germany if that's not where we live? But okay, so I'm going to go ahead and end this period, or end that statement there, and then we'd be ready to move on to the next section. But I think you got the gist of how this whole process works. On one side, you put in your says statement. On one side, you write in your does statement. So I'm going to stop right here and let you go about the process of highlighting in each section the most important information or information that you would use as part of summarizing that section, and then writing your own does and says statements in the margins. Okay, I hope this was helpful. Bye-bye. Okay, picking up from the previous page, tool making and the development of sophisticated language skills are just two of the many attributes we thought were exclusive to our species. Self-awareness is another. Okay, so now we're going to talk about this idea of self-awareness among animals. And that's going to take us into the next section. So technically, we need to erase the line that we drew above paragraph 10. No, actually, we're probably still okay because self-awareness becomes another topic that we should be covering. Let's read the next paragraphs. Some philosophers and animal behaviorists have long argued that other animals are not capable of self-awareness. Okay, so we've got the self-awareness connection here. That matches the self-awareness connection here, and that keeps us on the same track. Because they lack a sense of individualism. Not so according to new studies. At the Washington National Zoo, orangutans given mirrors explore parts of their bodies they can't see otherwise see, showing a sense of self. An orangutan named Chantek, who lives at the Atlanta Zoo, used a mirror to groom his teeth and adjust his sunglasses. Of course, when it comes to the ultimate test of what distinguishes humans from the other creatures, scientists have long believed that mourning for the dead represents the real divide. It's commonly believed that other animals have no sense of their mortality and are unable to comprehend the concept of their own death. Not necessarily so. Animals, it appears, experience grief. Elephants will often stand next to their dead kin for days, occasionally touching their bodies with their trunks. We also know that animals play, especially when young. Recent studies in the brain chemistry of rats show that when they play, their brains release large amounts of dopamine, a neurochemical associated with pleasure and excitement in human beings. Okay, wait a minute. We've shifted, because here we were talking about self-awareness in the previous paragraphs, and now we're talking about animals playing when they're young. So let's go back here and divide that section there before we go any further. Okay, all right, now we can go ahead and continue. Noting the striking similarities in brain anatomy and chemistry of humans and other animals, Stephen M. Sivey, a behavioral scientist at Gettysburg College in Pennsylvania, asks a question increasingly on the mind of other researchers. If you believe in evolution by natural selection, how can you believe that feelings suddenly appeared out of the blue with human beings? Until very recently, scientists were advancing the idea that most creatures behaved by sheer instinct, and what appeared to be learned behavior was merely genetically wired activity. Okay, there's another one. So here in paragraph 12 and 13, we were talking about animals playing and dopamine as a neurochemical associated with pleasure, and then going on the similarities in brain anatomy and chemistry of humans. And now we're shifting to this idea that animals are actually just behaving by sheer instinct. So let's go ahead and draw a line there. And then we will move on through our document to see what's happening in these last few paragraphs. Okay, so paragraph 14, until very recently, scientists were still advancing the idea that most creatures behaved by sheer instinct and that what appeared to be learned behavior was merely genetically wired activity. Now we know that geese have to teach their goslings their migration routes. In fact, we are finding that learning is passed on from parent to offspring far more often than not, and that most animals engage in all kinds of learned experience brought on by continued experimentation. So what does all of this portend for the way we treat our fellow creatures, and for the thousands of animals subjected each year to painful laboratory experiments? Okay, so now we've taken the shift to go back to where he started in the first couple of paragraphs, where he was talking about the idea of having a change of heart about animals, because something about them was different. This idea of them feeling pain and growing support for the humane treatment of animals. So we've almost come full circle. Consequently, we're going to draw a line under paragraph 14. Okay, and then we will look at the last 3 paragraphs. So what does all this portend for the way we treat our fellow creatures, and for the thousands of animals subjected each year to painful laboratory experiments, or the millions of domestic animals raised under the most inhumane conditions and destined for slaughter and human consumption? Should we encourage the sale and purchase of fur coats? What about fox hunting in the English countryside, bullfighting in Spain? Should wild lions be caged in zoos? Such questions are being raised. Harvard and 25 other U.S. law schools have introduced law courses on animal rights. And an increasing number of animal rights lawsuits are being filed. Germany recently became the first nation to guarantee human rights in its constitution. Okay, the human journey is at its core about the extension of, okay, so we've shifted now again. We're talking about what does this have to do with how we treat our fellow creatures up here. And then we went on to ask a few rhetorical questions at the bottom of that paragraph, and to continue with the fact that those questions are being raised in law schools across the country. But now this shift into the human journey takes us away from this idea of animal rights and whether or not we are treating them properly. So let's continue on to the next page. Okay, so the previous paragraph, or the last paragraph, began with the human journey is at its core about the extension of empathy to broader and more inclusive domains. At first, the empathy extended only to kin and tribe. Eventually, it was extended to people of like-minded values. In the 19th century, the first animal humane societies were established. 19th century. The current studies open up a new phase, allowing us to expand and deepen our empathy to include the broader community of creatures with whom we share the earth. Okay, so the conclusion is within that paragraph, and so we are good. Now we'll go back and take a look at how we do our does and says statements for the chunks that we've identified.